The metal door clanged shut behind her, the creak of the hinges blending into the distant roar of a Black Hawk helicopter just lifting off from the base. Inside the steel shipping container converted into a makeshift medical office, a flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead. They weren't supposed to be here. Not now. Not like this. Lieutenant Sarah Collins, the medic stationed at FB Falcon on the Syrian border, pressed her back against the wall, hands gripping the front of Captain Jake Harlow's dusty uniform. He was the lead technical officer, just back from a grueling 12-hour mission in the desert. Sand still clung to his lashes. His collar smelled faintly of sweat, engine grease, and warm metal. That scent, somehow, made Sarah feel more alive than she had in a long, long time. The first time they kissed, it wasn't about love, it was about exhaustion. About craving something that didn't come with an order or a mission briefing. But in that moment, on a military base nearly 7,000 miles from home, they crossed into something no one in uniform ever wanted to admit, a forbidden relationship, full of passion and shadowed by the risk of destroying not just their careers, but their lives. Jake had a wife back in North Carolina, 3 kids, and a house behind a white picket fence. Sarah was engaged to a Navy sailor stationed in Okinawa. But here, in this forgotten corner of the battlefield, surrounded by burning sand, gunfire, and the constant thrum of helicopters overhead, love, or what they mistook for love, hid in the dark. When the last flicker of the overhead light blinked and footsteps echoed just outside, they both held their breath. It wasn't just the fear of being discovered, it was the quiet realization that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. Lieutenant Sarah Collins, 32, was born and raised in Central Texas in a family with 3 generations of military service. Her father had served as a Marine officer. Her mother had been an Army nurse deployed to Kuwait. Sarah enlisted straight out of medical school, determined to serve her country and carry on her family's legacy. But she wasn't quite like her parents. There was a softness in her, a quiet yearning, the kind of dreams her fellow soldiers rarely glimpsed behind the crisp uniform and alert eyes. She had been assigned to FB Falcon, one of the hottest forward operating bases near the Syrian border, where daytime temperatures could soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit and nights were never free from the threat of shelling. Her job was to treat combat casualties, men brought back with torn flesh, shattered bones, or sometimes not brought back at all. Her days started at 5 a.m. with alarms and rarely ended before midnight, sometimes not at all if casualties came in overnight. She didn't have a private room, just a corner of the container partitioned off with tarp. No reliable internet. No phone. Only letters from home arriving at random, and promises from her fiancé stationed in Okinawa, "We'll have the wedding as soon as you get back." But the battlefield had a way of rewriting everything. In the darkness between shifts, Sarah learned to survive by holding herself together tight. She became quiet, precise, almost cold, until the day Jake Harlow walked into her clinic, bleeding from a shrapnel wound, and cracked a joke. "Think you could stitch up my heart too, Doc?" She laughed, a sound she couldn't remember making in months. Jake wasn't like the others. He carried himself like someone who'd seen too much. His eyes were sharp, his demeanor calm, his leadership solid but brotherly. He didn't try to impress anyone he didn't need to, and that was exactly what Sarah had been missing: steadiness, attention, and that gaze, like he could see straight through the armor she wore every day. What started as accidental encounters after night shifts became intentional. They drank instant coffee from paper cups, sat shoulder to shoulder along the blast walls at sunset, and talked about things no one could control, when the war might end, or when they might finally feel human again. Sarah couldn't say when it began. Maybe with that stitched wound, maybe with a glance that lingered half a second too long. But she knew this. She began to wait for him. In a place where everything was temporary, emotions became dangerously permanent. Sarah and Tom Miller had been engaged for nearly 2 years. They'd met during a joint military training course in San Antonio. Tom, a Navy corpsman with a warm voice and an easy smile, was the first man Sarah had ever truly trusted after years of brief, hollow relationships in the military. He wasn't romantic in the Hollywood sense, but he was dependable, safe, punctual. He always knew what he wanted. They parted with a promise. When you're back, I'll move to DC. We'll get married, buy a little house, get a dog, just like you always said. But when you're back slowly turned into something vague and weightless. Tom was stationed in Okinawa, while Sarah stayed in the Middle East far longer than expected. They tried to stay in touch, choppy calls, long emails, letters routed through the military system. At first, every message from him brought a smile. But then Sarah realized she wasn't waiting for them anymore. The stories Tom told about training, his new team, gym routines began to feel distant, like dispatches from a life that no longer included her. And when he asked, "Do you miss me?" her answer, "Of course I do," no longer felt true. She knew Tom loved her, in the way a good man loves a good woman, someone kind, steady, with shared values. But in those long nights filled with the sound of distant artillery, Sarah began to understand. What she and Tom had was compatibility, not fire. It was commitment, not hunger. It was what she should want, not what she couldn't resist. Sometimes, rereading Tom's letters felt like revisiting an old version of herself, the girl who believed love and loyalty were enough to build a life. But in this place, with death always nearby, Sarah had changed. She wasn't that girl anymore. And maybe, no matter how good he was, Tom didn't belong in this world she now lived in. One night, after saving a soldier torn apart by an IED, Sarah sat alone outside the clinic for nearly an hour, hands trembling, no one beside her. Tom didn't call that day, but Jake came. He sat next to her in silence. And sometimes, the right silence says more than any promise ever could. And maybe that was the moment, the first time she truly asked herself, if life is made up of choices, had she chosen the right person to walk the long road with? On the battlefield, every secondary forum moved too fast, too brutally, and too realistically. In the early days, Sarah still tried to maintain a normal rhythm of life. She kept a journal, folded Tom's letters neatly, and placed them carefully into a small Ziploc bag tucked beneath her pillow, like a symbol of hope for the day she'd return. But after 3 months, then 6, everything began to blur, like letters soaked in water. Tom still wrote. He called whenever he could. But his fight, steady and rhythmic, began to fade into the background of Sarah's world. There was no space for repetition here. Each day brought a new challenge, a sudden explosive assignment, a teammate misfiring during reloading, or a failed breach leaving more wounded than rescued. And in each of those moments, Sarah was always the first to rush in sleeves rolled up, the stench of blood thick in the air, moans echoing like a grim melody. In those brutal moments, Tom felt distant, like a faded dream. He talked about wedding plans, picking a cake, choosing their first dance song. Meanwhile, she was trying to keep a 19-year-old soldier alive as his lips turned pale from blood loss. He'd ask, "Are you getting enough sleep?" And she'd never mention how the night before she'd had to amputate a soldier's leg without enough anesthesia. Day by day, she stopped sharing, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't understand. Then other things began to fade, not betrayal, but color. Sarah started to feel like she was playing the role of a fiancé, rather than actually being one. She still sent pictures from the base, but didn't bother dressing up her words anymore. She said, "I'm okay," more often than "I miss you." Others began to notice the shift in her expression when someone mentioned Tom's name, the way she dodged questions about the wedding, or even how she no longer wore her silver engagement ring. She told them she'd forgotten it in a uniform pocket. But the truth was, she had tucked it away, herself, into her personal medical kit, like she was pressing pause on a piece of her life. One time, during a break, Sarah sat at the cold metal table in the medical tent, reading an email from Tom. The words were still sweet, still sincere. But instead of feeling warmth, she only felt tired. His love now read like letters arriving at the wrong time, not his fault, but no longer fitting. And in that silence, she began to realize she wasn't just drifting from Tom in distance, she was slipping from him emotionally, piece by piece. Every day lived here, between death and brutality, pulled her closer to a different path, a path she didn't yet have the courage to name. It wasn't betrayal, but she was clearly veering off course. Jake Harlow wasn't the charming type. He wasn't loud, didn't crack jokes like the fresh recruits, and never tried to win people over. A special operations leader with 12 years of combat experience, Jake only spoke when necessary, but when he did, every word carried weight. Sarah met him during a nighttime extraction mission, a bloody rescue deep in Fallujah. While Jake's team carried in a soldier with a chest wound, Sarah was stitching up another teammate. Her eyes stung with sweat, her hands numb from hours of surgery. But unlike the others, Jake didn't interrupt. He stood back quietly, simply watching her work. When she signaled 5 more minutes, he nodded like he understood that sometimes silence was the best kind of support. After that shift, Sarah found an opened can of military-issue coffee sitting beside her desk. No name. But she knew who left it. She didn't need to ask. From then on, they crossed paths more often, a nod across the dusty yard, a glance during a patient handover. And each time, Jake's presence stirred something strange in Sarah. Not peace, exactly, but a feeling of being seen. Not like Tom, who asked, "How are you?" out of habit. Jake didn't ask anything, but his eyes said he knew she was tired, tense, and alone in a way that words couldn't touch. One afternoon after a major attack, the base was on lockdown. Sarah, exhausted from sleepless nights, sat outside the barracks, unwilling to go back in because of the overwhelming scent of disinfectant. Jake passed by, stopped. He didn't say much, just handed her a protein bar and sat down beside her, leaning against the canvas wall. "I hate this smell," Sarah muttered, pointing toward the blood-soaked sand. Jake smirked. "Smells like I'm still alive." Sarah turned to look at him. His eyes, under the fading sun, were neither cold nor warm. Just real. After that, they talked more. Nothing flirtatious, nothing sweet. Just 2 soldiers sharing parts of the war that no one else could understand. Sarah spoke of shifts that ran until morning, decisions made without enough morphine, and the hollow quiet after losing a child on the operating table. Jake rarely spoke about himself. But when he did, about the wife who left him because she couldn't bear the long absences, about the nights on Overwatch in the icy hills of Iraq, Sarah listened. Because in his voice was a kind of weariness she understood. Little by little, Sarah began to look forward to seeing Jake during those rare quiet moments. A nod from him eased a weight she didn't even know she was carrying. And for the first time in months, she didn't long for Tom's calls. Instead, she craved those quiet conversations with Jake, where she didn't have to say she was okay or explain why she felt so hollow. She didn't notice, or maybe refused to admit, that something had started to form in those quiet, everyday exchanges. No fireworks, no declarations. Just a gaze held a second too long, a brush of hands when passing a water bottle, a heartbeat skipping out of rhythm. Sarah always thought infidelity happened in moments of weakness, in candlelight, over wine, or in whispers at anonymous hotels. But here, amid gunfire and the stink of military gear, betrayal didn't arrive as a moment. It spread slowly, like a crack in glass. She hadn't kissed Jake. She hadn't touched him in any way that fit the textbook definition of an affair. But every time she talked to him, every prolonged glance, every natural laugh that came more easily than it did during calls home, each was a step further from Tom. One night, after a nearly 20-hour emergency shift, Sarah returned to the med tent just before dawn. She sat on her cot, opened her laptop, and tried to reply to Tom's email. His first line read, "I'm counting the days until I see you in that wedding dress." Her eyes froze on the words wedding dress. An image that once made her heart race now felt alien, like it belonged to someone else. She typed a few words, erased them. In the end, she sent only one line, "I'm okay. Miss you." She lied. She wasn't okay. And she was missing someone else, the man she had no right to miss that way. Every time she saw Jake, she tried not to meet his eyes, as if holding his gaze too long might collapse whatever walls she had left. But in avoiding him, she only became more aware of his pull. He never took advantage of her silence. He simply existed. And in that presence, Sarah felt seen, understood, in a way that Tom, with all his earnest love, never quite managed. One time, Jake came to the med tent to report on a wounded soldier. When he handed her the clipboard, his hand brushed against hers, barely a touch. But in that instant, something inside Sarah locked up tight. Not because she was shaken. She hadn't acted on anything yet, but she knew clearly, painfully, that she had already gone too far. Her heart had started to betray her. That night, Sarah didn't eat. She sat alone on the bed, her slender hands holding a photo of her and Tom from their vacation in Cape Cod. In the picture, they were smiling brightly under the sun by the sea. But now, that smile felt foreign, like a fossil of a love weathered by time and war, cracked and brittle. She was leaving. Not with drama. No tears down her cheeks. Just a tightening in her chest, like something inside her was slowly shrinking. She wondered, am I a bad person? Or just someone trying to live authentically in a world that's all pretend? The truth was, Sarah didn't want to leave Tom. But she couldn't deny that her heart had begun to drift toward Jake, not because he was more handsome or sweeter, but because he stood with her in the unspoken spaces Tom never saw. In war, everything is more real, more urgent. Even forbidden emotions pulse with a kind of undeniable life. Sarah found herself straddling two worlds, the safe one she had promised to, and the dangerous one she couldn't stop being drawn into. And she knew if she kept walking this line, there'd come a time when she couldn't walk it back. That night, after another long day supporting frontline defense teams, the entire base fell into an unusual hush. Only the cold wind from the desert whispered through the dust. Sarah stood outside the medical tent, alone, holding a cup of coffee gone cold. She couldn't sleep. Night shifts and snap decisions in a war zone had stripped any sense of inner peace. She was exhausted, not just in her body, but from the questions that never had answers. And then, as if the universe wouldn't let her escape herself, Jake appeared. No announcement. Just a shadow in the dim light, then a familiar figure behind her. "Can't sleep?" Jake asked, his voice low and warm as if he already knew the answer. It wasn't a question, it was understanding. A recognition that had been growing between them for weeks. Sarah didn't turn right away. She stared at the coffee in her hand like it could somehow absorb the restless thudding in her chest. "I've had enough coffee to stay awake through the rest of the year," she replied, her voice dry. But in her eyes, something flickered, something she wasn't ready to admit. Jake stepped closer, but not too close. He stood beside her, near enough to feel the rhythm of each other's breath, but not touching. An invisible wall stood between them. Both knew that if they crossed it, there'd be no going back. And yet, in that moment, the wall didn't seem to matter anymore. "When was the last time you just felt like a normal person?" Jake asked. His voice was soft, but it sank into Sarah's muscles. It wasn't pressure, it was quiet encouragement, like he wanted her to let go of what she'd kept hidden for so long. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes blurred, as if resisting something she could no longer ignore. She felt Jake's presence more clearly than ever, every heartbeat like a note in an unsung melody, tense and sudden. "Sarah," he said her name, softer than ever before. Not a command, not a plea, but an invitation. She turned to face him, and this time, their eyes met. No more avoidance. Just silence. Heavy, suspended, like time had slowed to hold space for them. Jake said nothing more. He just waited, understanding that some things had to happen on their own. Sarah took a deep breath, one that felt like it could stretch across a lifetime. And when she finally spoke, the words came out of her mouth before she could stop them. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling even though she didn't know exactly what this was. "But I can't stop either." Jake didn't flinch. He just looked at her, his gaze steady, not indulgent, but full of understanding. "You don't have to stop, Sarah. No one's forcing you. But you do get to choose." His voice remained gentle, yet firm, like it held all the answers she hadn't been able to find on her own. In that moment, Sarah couldn't look away. And then, when she couldn't hold back any longer, she stepped closer until there was no space left between them. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from longing, a kind of hunger she'd never felt with Tom. Jake reached out, gently holding her hand. No words, just silent gestures. There was nothing left to explain. Sarah didn't know where she was headed, but she knew this. The moment she touched him, everything changed. After that night, their secret became a rhythm in Sarah's life with Jake, an undeniable part of her existence. The guilt, though still present, faded under the warmth of each quiet moment they stole together, in dark hallways, behind the curtains of the med tent. At first, they only crossed paths by chance. A quick word near the weapons depot, a brief exchange of medical reports in the dark. No lights, no proof, just the long pull of a glance they couldn't deny. Sarah started to feel her heart race whenever Jake came into view. She was no longer the composed medic, the woman with ice in her veins and steel in her spine. Sarah had become someone else, a woman lost in a story she no longer controlled. Their short conversations became her drug. She couldn't live without it. One night, while the base lay silent, Sarah saw Jake standing near the entrance to the quiet quarters. Break time had long passed. Everyone had returned to their posts. But he remained there, staring into the dark. He didn't look at her as she approached, but he knew she was coming. "Jake," she called, her voice a fragile breeze. Not out of fear, but out of the truth that, once they spoke again, there'd be no turning back. Jake turned, silent. His gaze met hers, and this time, there was no caution, just clarity. "I can't stay away," Sarah sighed, trying to hold herself together. "We can't keep doing this." Jake raised an eyebrow, as if he didn't quite agree. "You think I came here because I want to keep doing this?" "No, Sarah. I'm here because I can't stay away from you anymore." That sentence made her heart leap. Those words, to someone else, might have just sounded like ordinary sweet talk, but coming from Jake, they carried a different weight. Maybe he had sensed what Sarah had been trying to deny, that she felt it too. That this wasn't just fleeting encounters anymore. Not just conversation. It was something else now, a secondary current, a deepening bond that grew stronger each day, impossible to ignore. But Sarah didn't want to accept that. She looked away, trying to pull herself together. "What are we supposed to do with these feelings, Sarah?" Jake's voice had turned lower, more serious. "We can't keep pretending they don't exist." She didn't answer. She knew he wasn't asking for a confession. He just wanted her to face herself. And this time, there was nowhere left to hide. Every time they met, the pull between them grew stronger, and at some point, she couldn't tell the difference between right and wrong and what her heart truly wanted. That night, they stood close, with no distance left between them. Just a few heartbeats more, and Sarah knew they would cross a line they could never come back from. The feeling left her shaken, but strangely, it also gave her a sense of freedom she'd never known before. It wasn't about shirking responsibility, it was about finally allowing herself to feel something that had been buried for far too long. The next day, she returned to work, but every time she saw Jake in his uniform, a part of her, one that had been awakened, couldn't stop remembering those moments they had shared, moments that felt cut off from the world around them. And when their eyes met, she couldn't deny the truth, whether she liked it or not. She had begun to step into something she no longer had the power to stop. Everything began to unravel on a rainy night. The downpour didn't just soak the roads on the base, it seemed to seep into Sarah's heart as well. She knew she couldn't hide the truth forever. But she didn't expect that something as seemingly harmless as a routine would be the very thing that exposed her. Tom had been suspicious for a while, but he never asked her directly. Sarah's eyes weren't the same. Her smile had faded, and she'd been losing sleep for reasons she never explained. Tom knew the change wasn't just from work stress or family tensions. Something deeper was off. He could feel it, even if he didn't want to face it. That night, Tom did something he never imagined he would. He checked Sarah's phone. He wasn't the kind of man to invade privacy, but in the quiet, haunted hours of the night, fear and suspicion clouded his judgment. He picked up her phone, opened the messaging app, and scrolled through the short lines of text that made his heart twist. Jake, that was the name, his close friend, his colleague. But why did their messages carry such a strange intimacy? The conversations weren't about work or military duties anymore. They were filled with suggestions, veiled questions, and emotional undertones. Tom kept reading. The texts weren't just recent. There were words of affection, gentle phrases Sarah hadn't spoken to him in a long time. Each line cut deeper, breaking apart what he believed was their love. He had sensed the distance growing between them, but he never thought it would come to this betrayal. The last message was a plan to meet, and he didn't need to read anymore. Everything he needed to know was painfully clear. A cold numbness spread through him. Tom set the phone down and stood silently in the dark. The pain was sharp, unbearable. But he had no idea how to process it. The next morning, when Sarah returned from the night shift, the house no longer felt like home. There were no warm greetings, no shared stories about the day. No gentle hugs after long hours apart. Tom was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of untouched coffee. Tom, why haven't you gone to bed? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice calm, even as a silent dread rose inside her. Tom didn't answer right away. He looked at Sarah, not with anger, but with an emptiness she had never seen before. Is there something you want to tell me? His voice was quiet, but firm. Sarah felt the ground fall away. Her eyes widened, excuses and explanations choking in her throat. What could she say? What could she possibly say now that everything was out in the open? The meetings with Jake, the messages, the undeniable feelings. All of it was now in Tom's hands. I didn't know you'd found out, Sarah said, her voice trembling. It wasn't hard to find Sarah. I saw everything. He stood not angry, but his eyes looked at her like she was someone he no longer recognized. Did you really think you could keep this from me? The relationship. Jake, it's all very clear. Every word from Tom felt like a knife slicing through her. She had known this day would come, but she didn't expect it to hit this hard, this fast. There was nothing she could say to undo what had been done. Every feeling she had shared with Jake was now transformed into an unpardonable betrayal. Tom stood for a long moment, no longer looking at her. Then he turned, his expression unreadable, like he was staring at a complete stranger. What do you want now? Tom asked, not because he was hoping for answers. He already knew. Do you want to keep seeing him? Sarah couldn't say a word. She could feel everything inside her collapsing. There was nothing left to fix. Tom walked out, leaving her alone in the cold, quiet house with nothing but the sound of endless rain. And in that final silence, Sarah understood. Her life would never be the same again. The air in the house was no longer still. Everything felt compressed, tense, like you could hear the wind through the walls. Sarah stood there, eyes red and face tight with confusion, while Tom could barely contain the rage rising in him. Their conversation, if it could still be called that, was no longer a dialogue. It had become a confrontation. Do you even understand what you've done? Tom shouted, his face flushed with fury. He was no longer the man Sarah once knew, the calm, patient man. He was a man betrayed, a man in pain, and he couldn't take it anymore. Sarah just stood there, speechless. The air was thick, like something was about to explode. The words she had prepared to say had vanished. In his head, because at this moment, no words could calm the storm of anger Tom was enduring. I did everything I could to keep us stable, Tom went on, unable to hold back his emotions. I was always there for you, not just as a husband, but as your partner. I worked hard, gave up things I loved so you could have time for your career. And this is how you repay me? You betray me with someone else. Sarah wanted to explain, to say she hadn't meant for it to happen, that it was just a mistake made in a moment of weakness. But the words wouldn't come. There was no justification for what she had done. Nothing she could say would make it better. Jake, Tom scoffed, the name itself piercing through her like a blade. Do you love him more than you love me? Why? Why couldn't you show some reverence for what we had? Tom's question hit Sarah like a slap to the face. There was no answer. She couldn't say their love had changed, or that she had slowly lost her connection to him. She couldn't tell him that when she looked into Jake's eyes, she felt something stir in her heart, something she'd never felt in her relationship with Tom. You wouldn't understand, Sarah said weakly, finally breaking her silence, though her voice lacked the strength it once had. You can't understand what it feels like to not recognize yourself anymore. I didn't mean to hurt you, but I feel like I've lost everything. I feel like I lost myself in this marriage. And when I met Jake, I felt alive again. I felt loved, seen. Tom stared at her as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He stood still, his eyes empty, like the world had gone silent around him. So what? He said. You couldn't find any other way to deal with your feelings? You couldn't just tell me how you felt? Why did you have to lie to me? Sarah could only stand there, fists clenched, her eyes fixed on the floor as guilt consumed her. She had spoken her truth, but there was no way to undo what had been done. The sense of helplessness washed over her. Tom said nothing more. He turned and walked into the living room, closing the door behind him. The space between them widened with every second. Sarah stood frozen, staring at the door, unable to move. The house now felt like a battlefield, a place where betrayal hadn't just broken trust, it had shattered a marriage. There were no winners in this war. No mutual understanding. Only pain and emptiness remained. Sarah knew she couldn't fix what she had done to Tom, and she couldn't fix what had happened with Jake either. She had walked herself into a situation with no way out. All she had left now was regret, but was regret enough to make anything right? She stood alone, with no one to defend, no one to explain to, and in that moment, Sarah felt more alone than she ever had. She stood there, her eyes locked on the closed door of the living room. The tense moments when Tom had walked out without a word still echoed in her mind. The silence was suffocating. She was no longer Tom's wife, no longer the woman he had once loved. All that remained was a hollow version of herself and a love that could no longer be reached. Tom didn't return. She could hear his heavy breathing from the other room, but he didn't come back. Every sound, every breath felt like another blow, another painful reminder of her failure. Sarah knew she had taken it too far, and maybe, just maybe, Tom had already made up his mind. She picked up her phone, looked at the screen, then put it back down. Jake's message still hadn't been answered. She could seek comfort in him, but would that really help her rediscover herself? Or was it just a fleeting flame, burning bright in the ruins of a life that had already collapsed? Sarah sat down in the leather chair in the kitchen, her cold hands clasped tightly. She didn't know what to do anymore. Everything had gone too far. She couldn't turn back time. The relationship with Jake, brief as it was, had made her feel alive again, had made her feel loved. But was that really what she wanted to hold on to, now that everything had fallen apart? Tom walked into the kitchen, and Sarah knew she couldn't avoid it anymore. She turned to face him, her emptiness rising up again like a wave. There he was, not angry anymore, but distant, cold. His eyes no longer held disbelief, only a deep loss of trust. "Sarah, you need to make a choice," Tom said, his voice low, but with a clarity that Sarah couldn't deny. "I can't keep living like this. If you want to try and fix this, if you still want us, then you have to choose. I'm not going to live in a marriage without trust. I won't live with betrayal." Tom's words hit her like ice water, stripping away the last traces of denial in her heart. She had asked herself again and again if she could keep living in this limbo where love and truth no longer had clear meaning. But now, Tom wasn't the man she had known. He was tired, broken, and he couldn't carry this pain any longer. Sarah exhaled, her body slumping. She couldn't fight him anymore, couldn't fight herself. "Can you ever forgive me?" she asked softly. But the question wasn't just for Tom. It was a question for herself, too. Could a relationship this deeply damaged ever be saved? Tom stood still, not answering right away. He looked at her, as if listening to something buried deep inside her. But then his eyes shifted, as if he had made his decision long ago. "You don't have to say anything else," he said gently but firmly. "Sometimes it's not words, it's actions that matter. I've heard enough. Now it's up to you." Sarah didn't know what to do. Her life now felt like a maze with no way out. She wanted to go back, to undo what had been lost, but she didn't know where to begin. Her connection with Jake couldn't continue. But could she go back to Tom? Could she truly change, or had she already lost everything? At last, Sarah stood up and looked into Tom's eyes one last time. "You're right," she said, her voice soft, a quiet confession. "I won't hurt you anymore." Tom gave a small nod. No more anger, just resignation. They stood there in silence. No more words were exchanged. The decisions had already been made, not with words, but with actions. Love couldn't survive as just a beautiful idea. It had to be nourished by honesty and trust. And they had lost both. Sarah turned away, not knowing where she would go, but knowing with certainty that she couldn't return to her old life. She had made her choice. As for Tom, though the love was no longer what it used to be, he knew that the search for happiness would be a long road. The next day, the house remained silent. But this time, it wasn't the quiet of a relationship slowly fading without change. This silence felt different, more definite. It was like a void, an emptiness between two people who had once shared a life, but now had nothing left to say. Sarah began gathering her things around the apartment. She didn't glance at the family photos on the walls or the gifts Tom had once given her. Everything felt painfully clear now. What had she done to reach this point? She had broken everything, and now she had to face the consequences. Tom said nothing as he watched Sarah begin to pack. He sat in the living room, eyes locked on his phone, but there were no calls from Sarah, no messages from Jake. He knew she was beginning the process of leaving, but part of him still didn't want to say goodbye. Still, this silence, they both knew, it had been his decision. He had said he couldn't live in a marriage without trust, and now he was standing by those words. "Where will you go?" Tom asked, for the first time since their conversation had ended. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It sounded hollow, like he'd run out of the energy to fight. Sarah turned to face him. Her eyes were red, but the tears had stopped. She had cried too much already. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I need time. I need to find myself again. But I can't stay here not in the shadow of everything that's happened." Tom nodded, the acceptance clear in his eyes. "I understand," he said quietly. "You have to go. I won't try to stop you if you've already made up your mind." There was a pause. The only sounds were footsteps and the quiet sighs of a broken relationship. When Sarah finally left, part of her felt a strange sense of freedom. She didn't have to hide anything anymore. No more secrets, no more sidelong glances from Tom. But that freedom didn't bring joy. It felt like losing a piece of herself. She had lost her family, her husband, her partner. And now she had to accept that her relationship with Jake could never be a substitute for what she'd had. Sarah found a small apartment, a place to start over, free from expectations and pressures. But even after everything was unpacked, the feeling of loss lingered. She sat by the window, looking out at the world, reflecting on the present. She knew she would have to heal, to learn how to face her mistakes and rebuild from them. Tom didn't have it easy either. He didn't call or text Sarah, but the emptiness stayed with him through quiet moments. Life couldn't go back to what it had been. He had to learn how to live alone again, to rediscover himself in the mornings without Sarah, in the meals eaten alone, in the long nights without anyone to talk to. Day by day, Tom began to understand that what hurt most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the loss of a family, a home once filled with laughter and love. But part of him also recognized that maybe this was the moment to find his own sense of peace. Independence wasn't easy, but maybe it was a chance to rediscover who he was, to rise from the ruins. Both of them, in different places, had to learn to live with the decisions they'd made. They couldn't return to the past, but perhaps, in this new life, each of them would find a way to heal. And so, their lives moved forward, not together, but along two separate paths, each seeking happiness through the hard lessons they had learned. Time passed, and the deep emotions Sarah and Tom had endured during their breakup slowly began to change. Each of them, in their own corner of the world, had to face the truth. Nothing could ever go back to the way it was. But within the pain and loss, they discovered powerful lessons about love, about themselves, about life. Sarah was no longer the anxious, shattered woman she had been when she first left home. Those first days in the new apartment were painfully hard. Everything was unfamiliar, the mornings with no one to greet her, the long, lonely nights in a too quiet space. But as time went on, Sarah realized how much she had relied on others for comfort, how long she had ignored the fact that real healing had to come from within. One afternoon, sitting at a cafe, she reread some old journal entries. She had written about her dreams, her desires back when she and Tom first met. The romantic hopes, the promises about the future, all now seemed like a piece of the past she could never reclaim. But those memories weren't there to drag her backward. They reminded her that love should come from freedom and self-respect, not from clinging to a fading past. Sarah began to find joy in small things, quiet mornings, good conversations with friends, and activities she had once had no time for. She joined a yoga class, practiced meditation, and slowly returned to herself. She learned that independence didn't mean loneliness, it meant strength, the strength to face whatever life had in store. Tom went through a similar journey. The first days were hollow and painful, but slowly, he came to understand that not everything in life could be solved by logic. His relationship with Sarah couldn't be fixed, and parting had been the best thing for both of them. That didn't mean he'd given up on love. Instead, he reflected on what he'd learned. Love couldn't be held together by pressure or deception. It had to be built on openness, respect, and the courage to let go when necessary. Tom began to reconnect with his passion for work. He took on projects he had once set aside during the years of domestic life. He also started volunteering for a veterans support organization. He realized that while love within a family was important, giving back to the community brought its own sense of purpose and value. His sense of independence grew stronger, more grounded. He no longer saw himself as the victim of a failed marriage, but as someone who had learned deeply from the experience. He began to love himself again, to understand more clearly what he needed out of life. Looking back, both Sarah and Tom understood that while their marriage could have lasted longer, the lessons they took away were priceless. They came to see that love is not a destination, but a constantly evolving journey, one each person must learn to walk, no matter how difficult it becomes. Sarah learned to love herself before she could truly love someone else, and Tom realized that in every relationship, beyond romance, there must be understanding, sharing, and mutual respect. They knew that while the road ahead remained long and uncertain, they had at least found a sense of peace within themselves and could move forward on their own separate paths. A year had passed since Sarah and Tom parted ways. By now, both had learned how to adapt to independent lives and move forward with greater strength, even without each other. Sarah had started over. She was still living in the small apartment she had rented after leaving Tom's house, but now the space no longer felt cold or lonely. It had become the place where she rediscovered herself, where she began to rebuild her life from the simplest things. She completed a photography course, a passion she had always wanted to pursue but never had time for before. Today, Sarah wasn't just an independent woman, she was full of energy and ready to open the doors of her life to new opportunities. She joined a local photography group, and through those meetups, she connected with people who shared her passion. Her photos began to appear in small local gallery exhibits, and Sarah realized that creativity could help heal even the deepest wounds in the soul. She also started exploring the idea of a new relationship, but instead of seeking someone to replace what she'd lost, Sarah had learned to savor the quiet, silver-toned moments of life. Love wasn't her only goal now. Tom, on the other hand, was no longer the man trapped in the pain of failure. He became involved in several community efforts, especially supporting veterans, something that not only gave his life meaning again, but also helped him reconcile with lingering regrets from the past. Tom understood that life isn't always about chasing perfection, it's about acceptance and doing what's right, even in the face of hardship. His career also began to thrive. No longer stuck in the kind of projects he'd once toiled through, he now worked with larger teams on initiatives with deeper social impact. He built new friendships, colleagues who not only pushed him forward professionally, but also supported him personally. While a quiet emptiness still lived somewhere in his heart, Tom had learned to live with it without letting it control his life. Though no longer living together, Sarah and Tom maintained a respectful relationship. Occasionally, they'd see each other during holidays or when they needed to discuss shared responsibilities, and by then, the tension and unease between them had faded. They had fully made peace with the past, and most importantly, they knew that their separation, though painful at the time, had been the right decision. For Sarah and Tom, the end of one chapter didn't mean the end of everything. Though they couldn't continue the journey together, they had each found their own paths for growth and healing. They discovered peace in their hearts and, day by day, continued learning how to love life in their own unique ways.